The restaurant smelled of oak, seared meat, and quiet affluence. At the far corner, a man draped in bespoke tailoring glanced over the menu like it was a balance sheet calculating, precise, untouchable. He was a billionaire CEO, the kind whose presence shifted air pressure in a room without a word. Everyone else became background, the hum of conversation fading beneath his calculated gaze. At the same time, in a different rhythm, a young black waitress moved among the tables. She carried trays as if she were holding the weight of possibility itself, each step careful, measured, yet unassuming. She knew the world had labeled her small, inconsequential, but she also carried an inner compass, a quiet, unwavering intelligence that most people overlooked. Then it happened. He ordered a steak, rare, expensive, a silent proclamation of entitlement. She walked toward his table with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to navigate scrutiny without flinching. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from anticipation. Today she had something to say, something that would challenge the assumptions stacked like invisible walls around her. As she placed the plate before him, she slid a folded note across the polished wood. It wasn't a menu, it wasn't a receipt, it was a single deliberate message, measured in words, surgical in intent. The CEO paused mid-fork. One heartbeat, two. His eyes flicked down at the note, and just like that, the world stopped. The hum of the restaurant dimmed. He didn't speak, he didn't move, and for the first time in years, he was unsettled. Here's what that moment teaches us. Power is often assumed, but influence, the kind that reshapes decisions, perspectives, and systems, is earned quietly. A single action flipped the entire outcome, and neither the billionaire nor the bystanders knew it yet. She didn't know it yet, but she was about to show what happens when preparation, courage, and strategic intelligence intersect. By the time he looked up, the dynamics in the room had shifted. Something unspoken had entered the air. A single slip of paper, a quiet act, and an empire of assumptions teetered on the edge of collapse. The question that hung, invisible but tangible, was simple. What do you do when the unthinkable interrupts entitlement? And with that, the story begins. She didn't arrive at this moment by accident. Her story began years earlier, in a neighborhood where potential was abundant, but opportunity was scarce. From a young age she learned to read people before they spoke, to calculate risks before they materialized, and to see gaps in systems that others assumed were impenetrable. Life had taught her lessons most people ignored. Inequity is rarely obvious until it's personal, and the stakes are rarely low when you're overlooked. Her parents worked tirelessly, often unseen and underpaid, yet they imparted something invaluable: self-respect, discipline, and a belief that intelligence could be wielded as armor. She carried those lessons into every corner of her life. School was a training ground, jobs were a laboratory. Every setback, every dismissal, every whispered assumption of her limits became raw material for a quiet, accumulating strength. But the world was unrelenting. Systems of bias shadowed her at every turn. Doors closed before she even reached them. Promotions bypassed her resume. Compliments were tempered by invisible ceilings. She learned to navigate with care, to anticipate not just the immediate consequences, but the chain reactions triggered by small actions. Where others saw service work as menial, she saw a stage, a place to observe, to strategize, to understand human behavior at its most candid. Meanwhile, the billionaire CEO had lived a life constructed entirely differently. Wealth, connections, and influence insulated him from scrutiny. Mistakes were rare, and often invisible. Arrogance, habitual. He expected compliance, obedience, and quiet admiration. People like her were background noise, blips on the radar of his certainty. He had never been challenged in this precise way, and he had certainly never met someone who could see the invisible strings in his theater of control. Here's where the tension builds. She had the intelligence, the observation, the ethical compass, but she also had the uncertainty of youth, the risk of misjudgment, and the social conditioning to question her own worth. The note she slid across that table wasn't born of impulse. It was the culmination of years of preparation, of witnessing and internalizing injustice, of decoding patterns that the powerful assumed were theirs alone. And in that moment, two worlds collided, one built on entitlement and external validation, the other built on internal mastery and strategic observation. It was a quiet collision, almost imperceptible, but it carried the weight of decades. The power imbalance felt permanent, until she acted. She didn't know it yet, but the systems designed to minimize her influence were about to be disrupted, not through confrontation, but through precision, intelligence, and moral clarity. And in that unfolding disruption lies the secret to transformation. Real power often moves silently, unseen until the effect is undeniable. The question now becomes, when faced with a moral fork, do you follow fear, or do you follow insight? Do you comply, or do you rise? That moment, the moment before a choice, is where character is forged. She held the note in her hand for a brief, almost imperceptible moment before sliding it toward him. A choice hovered above her like a storm cloud. No one else in the restaurant knew the weight of that small slip of paper, but she did. This was more than a simple gesture. It was a moral crossroads, a test of courage, strategy, and principle. On one path lay compliance. She could act like any other server, take the order, smile politely, and retreat into the rhythm of routine. She could avoid risk, maintain comfort, and preserve invisibility. It would be safe, unremarkable, and unnoticed. Just another day in a system designed to minimize her presence. But the other path, the one that required courage, was risk-laden. The note contained truth and challenge, designed to disrupt the predictable narrative of power. It was an act that could provoke embarrassment, retaliation, or dismissal. She knew the world could be unforgiving to those who dared defy expectation, and she also knew that her reputation, livelihood, and emotional safety were at stake. Here's what that moment teaches us. Moral clarity often arrives disguised as risk. Every choice, even the smallest, carries consequences. But inaction carries its own quieter, yet far-reaching cost. A single action guided by insight and principle can alter the trajectory of an encounter, a career, or even a system. She didn't know it yet, but the choice she made would reveal an unseen power. Her understanding of human behavior, the way entitlement bends under scrutiny, the way the unexamined assumptions of the powerful can unravel, gave her an advantage. Intelligence, after all, is not measured by degrees or titles, but by the ability to act decisively in moments where others hesitate. As she slid the note forward, time slowed. She felt the familiar pulse of doubt, but it was tempered by preparation. Every observation, every calculated risk, every lesson from years of navigating bias and injustice had led her to this quiet act of defiance. The fork in the road had been chosen. The CEO paused, momentarily frozen, not by anger, but by the subtle, almost imperceptible weight of confrontation cloaked in civility. The note demanded attention, reflection, and perhaps discomfort, and therein lay the genius. She didn't attack him, she didn't accuse, she simply invited him to see what others ignored. And in that pause, so brief that most would miss it, the first shift occurred. Power was no longer absolute. The room, the moment, and the story itself held their collective breath. She didn't know it yet, but the balance had begun to tilt, quietly, inexorably, toward insight over entitlement. The question now becomes what happens when hidden intelligence confronts assumed power, and how does a single act, guided by principle, begin to rewrite the rules? At first glance, she was just a waitress. Uniform crisp, apron tied neatly, demeanor professional. But that was the illusion. What the billionaire CEO and the surrounding patrons didn't see was the accumulation of subtle, strategic intelligence that had brought her to this moment. Every glance, every pause, every carefully observed detail of human behavior had been catalogued, analyzed, and stored as actionable insight. She didn't rely on overt confrontation. Her power was in perception. She had studied negotiation, human psychology, and the silent rules of influence long before this night. She could anticipate the reactions of someone like him, the arrogance, the impatience, the subtle micro-expressions that betrayed insecurity beneath wealth and status. Most people never learned to read between the lines, but she had made it a practice, a survival skill turned mastery. Now, as he stared at the note, her intelligence began to surface, not as spectacle, but as effect. She had anticipated exactly how he would pause, how his mind would race to understand the intent without causing a scene, and how his ego would resist immediate acknowledgement. She had crafted the wording of that note to pierce entitlement with precision, enough to unsettle, but not enough to provoke confrontation. Here's what that moment teaches us. Brilliance often hides in plain sight. The world rewards visible achievement, but influence, insight, and the ability to shift outcomes silently can be exponentially more powerful. A single well-considered move can recalibrate the balance of a room without a raised voice or a public declaration. She didn't know it yet, but the note was more than words. It was a lever. It had the potential to change the narrative, to command attention, and to challenge assumptions in a way that no argument or complaint could, and this was just the first subtle reversal of power. The CEO, for all his authority, had no idea that the quietest person in the room was now in control of the moment. The room itself seemed to acknowledge the shift. Conversations dimmed slightly, the ambient noise fading against the tension at that table. People weren't consciously aware of the invisible pivot, yet they felt it. Influence isn't always loud. Sometimes it is measured, deliberate, and internalized, radiating in ways others can sense but not name. And in the quiet, she found her confidence growing. She didn't need applause or acknowledgement. Her power had always been in preparation, observation, and ethical clarity. A single action had begun to unsettle a seemingly unshakable system, and she was only getting started. The question now becomes, how does one sustain this hidden power in the face of systemic obstacles and public scrutiny? What happens when the world pushes back, and the consequences of a courageous act threaten to escalate? The note had landed, the first subtle shift achieved, But the world rarely allows quiet triumphs to go untested. Within minutes, the billionaire CEO began to process what he had just read. He was accustomed to unquestioned authority, but this moment exposed a vulnerability he had never faced. And as he hesitated, the systems around him, the invisible architecture of entitlement, power, and reputation, rose like walls against her act of quiet defiance. A manager, unaware of the subtleties at play, hovered at the edge of the table, sensing tension. Fellow diners, curious yet oblivious to the true stakes, glanced her way. The room became a theater of silent judgment, each observer unknowingly adding weight to the unfolding drama. It was not confrontation they sought, but recognition, a recognition she had no intention of granting on their terms. And then came the internal breakdown. The CEO's initial composure cracked, a twitch in his jaw, a shift in posture. The hum of confidence that usually cloaked him dissolved into subtle agitation. She could see it, as she had anticipated. But the public breakdown was more than just a display of personal discomfort. It was the exposure of a system's flaw. Entitlement, untested, is brittle. Once challenged, it fractures. Here's what that moment teaches us. Systemic obstacles are designed to maintain the status quo, yet even the most rigid structures can be destabilized by insight combined with courage. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't call him out publicly, and yet, the act of subtle defiance forced the system to reveal its weakness. She didn't know it yet, but this was the crucible. In these moments one learns whether preparation and intelligence can withstand the pressure of public scrutiny. Each second the CEO sat frozen, his mind racing, served as proof that strategy and moral clarity often work quietly behind the scenes, far more effectively than aggression or confrontation. And still, the world pushed back. A waiter tripped nearby, a tray clattered, chaos amplified tension. She felt the micro stakes pressing in. This could escalate, spiral, or even backfire. Every instinct told her to stay calm, to continue her performance of normalcy, but internally, every observation was active, calculating the potential consequences of every subtle move. The room itself seemed to pulse with the uncertainty she had engineered. Observers felt discomfort, though they could not articulate why. A single act of insight had begun to ripple outward, but her victory was far from assured. The question now becomes, when the pressure mounts, when the public and systemic forces challenge every step, how does one pivot without losing control? How does quiet intelligence transform into decisive action? Just as tension threatened to peak, a subtle revelation shifted everything. She remembered a conversation from weeks earlier, a mentor's insight, shared almost in passing. True influence is never about proving power. It's about creating understanding that can't be ignored. That phrase, once theoretical, now became her guiding principle. The breakdown unfolding before her was no longer a threat. It was an opportunity. She realized the note was only the first move. Influence, true influence, required strategic follow-through. A single slip of paper had rattled entitlement. But if she wanted lasting impact, she needed a plan that extended beyond that moment, one that leveraged intelligence, observation, and ethical precision. Here's what that moment teaches us. Insight without action is like a seed planted in barren soil. Observation, intelligence, and courage are vital, but transformation requires deliberate strategy. A single action can start a ripple, but a thoughtful plan determines whether it becomes a wave. She didn't know it yet, but the mentor's words had unlocked the blueprint in her mind. She began to map the dynamics of the room. The CEO's pride, the expectations of the staff, the assumptions of the diners, and the invisible hierarchies that govern behavior. Each element was a lever, each relationship a potential pivot. Her strategy was quiet but precise. First, she would maintain calm and composure, no sudden movements, no overt reactions. Next, she would create subtle cues that encouraged reflection without confrontation. A carefully timed gesture, a measured pause, a quiet smile, each action calculated to reinforce observation over reaction. Finally, she would prepare for the public moment, where insight could flip the narrative entirely, exposing arrogance, not with attack, but with clarity. At the same time, she internalized another critical truth. Transformation often requires patience. Power shifts rarely occur instantly. They accumulate through quiet wins, observation, and measured influence. Impulsiveness would betray her advantage. Strategic execution meant resisting the temptation to escalate prematurely. And so, a new mindset emerged. A quiet, unshakable confidence, grounded in preparation and principle. The room remained tense, the CEO still unsettled, yet she moved with the certainty of someone who understood the architecture of influence. She didn't just react, she orchestrated, anticipating consequences, aligning leverage, and preparing for the eventual reversal. The question now becomes, how does one translate preparation and insight into tangible outcomes? How do subtle shifts in perception evolve into decisive change? With the turning point behind her, she moved into execution mode. Every gesture, every glance, every response became part of a larger strategy. This was no longer about a single note or a fleeting moment. It was about guiding the CEO and by extension the room toward insight, reflection, and ultimately transformation. She began with subtle cues. When he fumbled over the note, she allowed a quiet pause, giving space for thought, rather than confrontation. When his initial defensiveness surfaced, she responded with calm professionalism, signaling observation without judgment. Each interaction was a measured step, a deliberate chess move. Her advantage lay in restraint. The more she observed, the more she understood, and the more her influence grew without a word raised. Here's what that moment teaches us. Execution is where preparation becomes power. Many falter not in planning, but in implementation. Quiet, deliberate actions, done consistently, can reshape perceptions and recalibrate dynamics far more effectively than any overt act of confrontation. She didn't know it yet, but each small silent victory was stacking toward a tipping point. The CEO's confidence waned subtly with every unacknowledged micro-reversal. His entitlement, once rigid and unquestioned, was now being quietly interrogated by her presence and insight. He still had all the trappings of power, yet the narrative was shifting beneath him. Behind the scenes, she leveraged social psychology without making it obvious. Humans respond to observation, subtle challenge and reflection. By maintaining her composure, she encouraged self-awareness in the CEO, a mirror he could not avoid. Each minute she sustained this dynamic. Her influence deepened, and the power balance continued its quiet, inexorable shift. The environment itself seemed to bend around her strategy. Colleagues and bystanders began to notice subtle changes, pauses, shifts in tone, attention that was not aggressive but undeniable. Influence, she understood, was often invisible until it manifested in tangible change. And these invisible threads were now weaving her victory. At the same time she prepared for the public moment that would culminate the strategy. The silent climb required patience, observation, and precision timing. A single misstep could unravel weeks, if not years of accumulated intelligence. Her advantage was hidden, but potent foresight, composure, and an understanding of human behavior that few could match. The question now becomes, how does one transform a quiet, strategic climb into a visible, undeniable reversal? How do the invisible victories coalesce into a public moment that reshapes perception, authority, and consequence? The moment arrived with quiet inevitability. The CEO, still unsettled, reached for the stake but paused, hesitated mid-motion, as if the weight of the note had physically anchored him. The room felt the shift, even if most couldn't articulate it. What had begun as a subtle disruption now rippled outward, changing the energy in the air. She didn't need to raise her voice. She simply engaged him with the same calm, intelligent presence that had carried her through every prior step. Her actions, small, deliberate, and measured, had created a mirror he could not ignore. The arrogance that had once insulated him from consequence was now vulnerable, exposed by insight rather than insult. Here's what that moment teaches us. Real power often manifests quietly before it becomes visible. It's the convergence of preparation, patience, and intelligence that produces a tipping point. A single strategic move can unravel assumptions, not with force, but with precision. And then it happened. He read the note again, slowly this time, the words sinking in. The restaurant fell silent, not because of any public spectacle, but because transformation was occurring in real time, right before their eyes. The billionaire's face, usually a mask of controlled authority, softened. A flicker of recognition crossed his eyes, the realization that he had underestimated not just her, but the quiet, persistent intelligence that could shift outcomes without a fight. She didn't know it yet, but this was the first visible consequence of her silent climb. The CEO's body language, his faltering dominance, the subtle recalibration of his attention, all were indicators that influence, when wielded with strategy and principle, could reshape a system from the inside out. In that moment the public reversal was complete. The power dynamic had shifted, yet no one needed to shout, argue, or humiliate. Her victory was moral, intellectual, and systemic. She had exposed arrogance, preserved dignity, and demonstrated that insight outweighs entitlement. The room exhaled, almost collectively, though no one acknowledged the change aloud. The invisible had become visible, the underestimated now recognized. She had not just succeeded in that moment, she had created a blueprint for how quiet intelligence could challenge power, without spectacle, without aggression, but with undeniable effect. And as the CEO finally met her gaze, the tension broke, not in anger, but in understanding. He realized that influence does not always reside in titles, wealth, or outward authority. Sometimes it lives in those who observe, prepare, and act with both courage and strategy. The question now becomes, what are the consequences of such a reversal? How does transformation ripple beyond the immediate moment, affecting the system, the people, and the future? The restaurant returned to its usual rhythm, but nothing would ever be the same. The CEO, once an immovable presence, now carried the subtle mark of insight and self-reflection. His entitlement, once assumed as unchallengeable, had been quietly examined and unsettled, and though he continued to dine, to lead, and to operate in his world of wealth and influence, a part of him had shifted. He no longer saw every interaction as a confirmation of dominance. He had witnessed firsthand the power of observation, intelligence, and principle. For her, the aftermath was quieter but no less profound. She returned to her duties, carrying the invisible weight of victory and the hum of a system subtly transformed. The ripple effects were immediate. Co-workers noticed her confidence, patrons responded differently, and even the staff hierarchy acknowledged without words the strategic brilliance she had demonstrated. Influence, she had learned, often works invisibly first, then reshapes reality around it. Here's what that moment teaches us. True transformation is rarely explosive. It is cumulative, subtle, and systemic. One person's courage can initiate change not only in those they confront directly, but also in everyone who observes the outcome. A single action, careful, deliberate, and principled, can have a cascading effect that extends far beyond the immediate moment. The CEO faced his own internal reckoning. There was no public humiliation, no punitive confrontation. Rather, he confronted himself. What he had taken for granted, control, superiority, unquestioned authority, was now subject to reflection. In that quiet, almost imperceptible shift, he found the potential for personal growth. The system that had enabled his dominance remained largely intact, but his perception of it, and his role within it, had been irreversibly altered. She didn't know it yet, but the lessons she imparted through subtle intelligence would echo in decisions he made long after leaving the restaurant. The moral power of preparation, courage, and insight had transcended a single interaction. The systemic ripple, initiated by a folded note and calm observation, had begun. And in that quiet aftermath, a principle emerged. Victories achieved through integrity, intelligence, and strategy often leave a legacy that far outlasts immediate recognition. She had not just won a moment, she had set an example, created a blueprint, and demonstrated that even the most entrenched systems can be nudged, gently but irreversibly, toward justice and understanding. The question now becomes, how do we carry these lessons forward? How do we apply the power of quiet, principled strategy in our own lives, to influence systems, challenge assumptions, and create meaningful change? The room had quieted, the plates cleared, and yet the impact lingered like a subtle vibration. What began as a simple act, a note, a pause, a measured observation, had transformed the narrative of power, influence, and respect. It was a reminder that leadership is not always loud, and victory is not always public. Some triumphs resonate silently but permanently, altering perspectives, systems, and hearts. For her, the legacy was both personal and universal. She had acted with courage, intelligence, and ethical precision. She had not sought revenge or recognition. She had leveraged insight to create understanding. And in doing so, she had shown that even those overlooked by society can command influence, shape outcomes, and challenge assumptions in ways that ripple far beyond a single moment. Here's what that moment teaches us. The power to transform systems, disrupt entitlement, and create meaningful change often resides in those who prepare, observe, and act with quiet clarity. A single thoughtful action can shift entire dynamics, if it is guided by principle, insight, and courage. The CEO, now reflective, would carry the memory of that encounter into his decisions, leadership, and interactions. He had been challenged, unsettled, and ultimately enlightened, not by force but by intelligence and moral clarity. And that is perhaps the most enduring lesson. Influence rooted in principle endures longer than authority rooted in fear or entitlement. And for us watching, the takeaway is clear. The tools of strategy, patience, and observation are available to anyone willing to cultivate them. The ripple effect of principled action extends beyond the individual, shaping systems, inspiring change, and creating opportunities for justice where none seemed possible. So here's your challenge. Observe carefully, act decisively, and approach life's moments with both courage and strategy. Ask yourself, what small deliberate action could I take today that might quietly transform my world, challenge assumptions, or create opportunity for others? If this story resonated with your values, if it sparked reflection on your own power and potential, then carry that energy forward. Like, comment, and subscribe, not just to witness stories, but to embrace them as lessons in strategy, resilience, and principled influence. Remember, the quietest moves, executed with intelligence and integrity, often leave the loudest, most lasting impact.